Anybody sitting outside, come on in and get a chair. So I am Lauren Bennett. I am with Walk Austin. Thank you very much for coming. We're really excited about this event, as I am sure all of you are. Can y'all do me a favor? And I want to get a feel for who's in the room. So I'll give you a softball. How many people think Austin could be more walkable? Excellent, you're in the right room. All right, so how many of you are ready to roll up your sleeves and do the work necessary to make Austin more walkable? All right, hang on one second. Keep your hands up. Keep your hands up. Okay, now you've all been, you're now all on record as volunteering for Walk Austin. About last January, I believe, Councilmember Chris Riley's office came to Walk Austin and said, hey, you know what would be really cool? I said, oh, what? It would be great if we could bring Jeff Speck to Austin. And I thought, yeah, that would be awesome, but who the heck is going to do that? He's a rock star. How could we ever get him here? And I think I can quote Chris saying, I don't know, you should just figure it out. And so here we are. And so we started raising money. We got this great group of sponsors. Capital Metro jumped on board immediately. They really understand that they need to combine their services with walkable areas. The Imagine Austin speaker series, Compact and Connected, we're all trying to get there. You can't get that without being walkable. AARP, I mean, I don't even think I said anything. We just like worked it out telepathically. So they're very on board and back there. The Downtown Austin Alliance, making Austin or keeping downtown a vital area, much more vital than having pedestrians walking around having a good time. The health community jumped right up. They understand that moving your body, walking is essential. So St. David's Foundation and Central Health signed on. Congress for New Urbanism and Movability Austin, two great nonprofits here doing different things, jumped on board. And then the development community. Astera Properties, Constructive Ventures, Momark Development, Southwest Strategies Group, all giant players in the Austin Development Group, all wanted to be a part of this event. So we're really excited, and I'm going to introduce my friend, Councilmember Riley, to kick it off.
Thanks so much, Lauren. You know, I had no doubt when I had that conversation with Laura a while back that she would figure it out. Because Lauren is somebody who always figures it out, and we are going to miss Lauren so much. And I want to, for everybody who knows Lauren, everybody who's a fan of walkability in Austin and knows well Lauren's worked on all this for some time now, and we're so grateful, and we are going to miss you so much as you venture off to other things. What an exciting time this is in Austin. We are going through so much. And today was just great. Today we actually had all kinds of rock stars here. We actually had the rock stars in the fields of code writing here in town. Dan Perola and Peter Park working on Code Next. And now Jeff Speck here. What an exciting time as we venture forward with the rewrite of our land development code. And yet, even with all this great national star help we've got here, some people are still a little anxious about where we're going with the rewrite of our land development code. It seems like when people show up and say, I'm a planner and a code writer and I'm here to help, you don't always get the kind of reaction you might like. And that's understandable. You know, it was over 50 years ago now when Jane Jacobs issued her attack on then current city planning and rebuilding, and yet, even though her ideas sank in with many over the next couple of decades, it still seems like we're fighting many of the same old battles that she was fighting as she wrote her book. A lot of that has to do with the fact that much of our code, much if not most of our code, dates to a time when her ideas really hadn't gotten much traction. But the ideas and the old school just still lingers on in so many ways. Right? We've been having a conversation about what to do with the freeway that runs through our downtown, and at times that has had echoes of the whole Robert Moses fight about the effects that's going to have on nearby neighborhoods. And it seems like we're still fighting the same old battles that she was fighting so long ago. It's that sort of institutional inertia with the old system that Jeff Speck has spent his career combating. He spent 10 years starting out with Andre Swanee and Elizabeth Titus-Iberg down in Florida, starting in 1993. And many of us first got to know of Jeff's existence in 2000, with the issuance of what is known to many as a Bible for urban planning, the Suburban Nation. How many of you have either had Suburban Nation or are familiar with it? Yeah, most everybody who's into all this urban stuff has at least come across Suburban Nation.
You can still buy it.
You can still buy it. It's not too hard to find. After that, he went on to work as Director of Design at the National Endowment of the Arts from 2003 through 2007. He presided over the Mayor's Institute on City Design and created a new initiative, the Governor's Institute on Community Design. Since then, and since 2007, he has led Speck & Associates, LLC, a boutique planning firm that specializes in making downtowns more walkable. And then in 2012 it was that he issued another book that has become very familiar to many, A Walkable City. And okay, raise your hand if you've come across this book before. If you don't, you can definitely buy this book. And if you haven't, you really should. Last year at the Congress for New Urbanism in Salt Lake City, it seemed like every single session, the one work that you can count on coming up in most every session there at the Congress for New Urbanism was Walkable City. This is the book that everybody was talking about. Because the concept it has is just so simple. It's just, if we can just get this one thing right, it will solve so many of our problems, and it's just a matter of basic walkability. It is a little more complicated than it sounds. Sometimes when we talk about walkability in Austin, sometimes we're talking, but it seems like we're just focusing on whether there's a sidewalk there. Do we have a safe and usable sidewalk that will get you from point A to point B? And yet there is so much more to walkability than that. Walkability has to do not just with a useful sidewalk, it has to do with the fabric of a city. It has to do with having a place that actually puts places within easy reach of a comfortable stroll. About the way the conditions that Jeff talks about are, we're striving for a place in which a walk can be useful, safe, comfortable, and interesting. Useful, safe, comfortable, and interesting. And that turns out to be quite a challenge in many places, especially in a place like Austin, where for so many decades, so much of our development was centered strictly around the car. It was based on the assumption that nobody would be walking anymore because everybody would be driving everywhere. And so why do you even need to have places within reach of a stroll, and much less interesting places along the way? And so there are great challenges to actually creating those conditions that are right, that will actually get us so far that we can really feel like we've created a walkable place. And yet the payoff is just so enormous. Jeff has written that America has so many problems, walkability solves most of them. It actually offers so many solutions, and he will elaborate on exactly on what he means by that. Since the time he's written, there have been others who are pointing out even more solutions even more benefits to walkability. Charles Montgomery has written about how walkability actually turns out to create the conditions that are conducive to human happiness all over the globe, not just in a place. Much of human happiness comes down to basic matters of walkability, just the very kinds of things that Jeff was talking about in his book. It is so important for us to make progress on getting towards those conditions. It is absolutely critical for the present. It's critical for us to think about it as we strive towards the implementation of our comprehensive plan and the rewrite of our land development code. And even more important, it is so critical for the future. And there is a certain inevitability to all these discussions, because the good news is, for the young people in America, this is even more important than it is to others. Jeff points out that 77% of millennials plan to live in America's urban cores. 77%. And what they're looking for is a type of place that is different from the place that many of us have known for many years. It is a place that has exactly those conditions that Jeff was getting to. making progress towards that vision would actually represent the fulfillment of many aspects of the Imagine Austin Comprehensive Plan. It would mean that many more Austinites would finally have the opportunity to experience the type of urban environment that Jane Jacobs described so well 50 years ago. I'm so glad that Jeff is with us here today to help nudge us along on that path as we strive towards creating the kind of place that will create those conditions that are conducive to a healthy, happy city. So thank you so much for being with us.
Wow. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Chris. Well, it's the most welcome I've ever felt. And the audience of greatest width. We'll get this to work. The audience of greatest width that I have ever faced. That's not a Texas thing, is it? So it's so great for me to be here. I don't usually butter up the audiences that I talk to, but you could ask my friends, they will tell you Austin is certainly the only place in Texas I would ever live. It's my favorite place in Texas. And we're going to get into why in a minute, because it's relevant to the conversation. But, I love the border towns. I've done some work in McAllen and in San Antonio and some other places, and everywhere along the border where you feel like, Mexico is close, and that's a great place to be in Texas. And I love Austin, and I really don't want to go anywhere else in Texas. And they don't really want me either. In fact, I haven't been invited to Dallas. I haven't been invited to Houston. And it's really interesting as I've done this. I won't call this the book tour anymore because now I'm just back to doing lectures the way I've always been doing lectures. But most people who invite me are inviting me because they've read the book, or someone who's read the book told them to invite me. But so many of the cities I go to are cities that don't need me. Because, in fact, if you have the kind of city, typically, not always, and there are exceptions we'll talk about, but if you have the kind of city that can generate this kind of audience, in an urban church in a downtown on a weeknight and has that sort of culture that actually grows from place, then you're probably doing pretty well. And so the list of the places I've spoken, with a few exceptions, strangely, is a list of a lot of places that are further along on this curve. Not exclusively, though, so that's good. We're spreading the message everywhere. But the challenge I face tonight, I had to rewrite the whole first part of my talk, which is about what Chris talked about. Oh, and thank you, Walk Austin, and let me interrupt. This is Lauren's last event in her job, and I really can't screw it up, so I'm very nervous about that. But she does look like someone who's about to go to Italy tomorrow, and that's just wonderful. So thank you to Walk Austin. But I had to rewrite the whole first part of my talk because you don't fit my mold at all. Because you have achieved, everywhere I go wants to attract millennials. And the way I start is by saying, yes, you want millennials, you want to attract these engines of entrepreneurship, you want to attract young people who make almost every invention you can think of was invented by someone under 30, and you want these people in your community. And people tell me, the older people in the community just say, how can we get our kids to stay, and how can we get our grandkids to stay? And this is the conversation that I usually launch off with. But you've already got that, and you're attracting these young people. And then I'm in places all over America, and people talk about the cities they want to be like. And it's all the places that fit my mold, like San Francisco and Portland and Washington, D.C., and what New York City's been doing lately with its streets, and Boulder. And they say Austin. But Austin is not walkable. Okay? And this is where I might make some enemies. But by my criteria, now let me just make this clear. I've been coming here about 5 times for the past 10 years, and what you've accomplished over that time is spectacular. And it's clear that the work that you're doing now is getting you there much faster than what the typical American city is doing. Number one. Number two, you have great bones. You have this grid system that you've done. Someone was in our windshield tour today. Someone was saying, and we've mega blocked some of our blocks. And in fact, compared to most other cities in America, you've done very little your grid is largely intact. And so you have a framework that means that you can become walkable very quickly. But in terms of all the cities that I use to sell walkability to other cities, I'd always twitch a little bit when Austin comes up. Because the typical street in Austin, frankly, looks like the typical street in the cities I'm trying to fix. Okay? So that's the challenge, is why am I right? If people are coming to Austin anyway, and if millennials are so attracted to Austin anyway, and it doesn't have many of the qualities that I use to sell walkability to cities, then why is what I'm selling worth anything? And I'm thinking, I always ad-lib my introductions because it's more interesting, but I can screw up very easily. I'm thinking that, it's the other things. Now, let me just interrupt to say that certain aspects of walkability are, what isn't working so well in Austin is just the streets, what's between the curbs, okay? But you've got a lot of comfort and interest. You've got the interesting walk and the comfortable walk on a lot of your streets, a lot of really interesting buildings. I know that's changed over the past decade, but a lot of great spaces being framed by buildings. And then, of course, you have the tremendous arts and music and culture, and you have the fact that a liberal Jew from New England would live here, right? And nowhere else in Texas. So you've got all these other things. You've got all these other things that add up to attracting these cultural creatives that are also attracted to walkability. So I think the story I have to tell here is a little bit different. It isn't that you need to become more walkable in your streets to attract these people, because you're already getting them. But you definitely have to become more walkable to give them what they truly want once they're here, and to make them want to stay even more, but actually just to give them a better life. And Chris alluded to some of these statistics I like to use. My generation, and this is the economist Chris Leinberger talking, my generation grew up, every day I watched Gilligan's Island, Partridge Family, and The Brady Bunch. Those are the 3 shows I watched. Gilligan's Island had very little to say about urbanity. But the other 2, it was walkable. But the other two was what I was living. It was the suburban, the low-slung house on the leafy lot surrounded by more of the same, and this was very good. And this generation that every city wants to attract, the millennials, well, they grew up on Seinfeld, Friends, Sex and the City, and they were a much more suburban generation than mine. In fact, the majority of suburbia was built between when I was born, and when they were born. Yet this generation that grew up more suburban than me grew up wanting to live in cities because of the media they were consuming, but also, I think, because they were just stuck in the back of their parents' car so much and driving so much. And when I was young, 1 out of 12 19-year-olds opted out of getting a driver's license. Now it's 1 out of 4. So this is the generation that the J.D. Powers, the folks who do the polling for the auto industry, hardly part of the anti-car lobby, is saying they're not interested in cars anymore. We have to sell them something else, right? So these folks are coming here, and I'm skipping the whole part of my talk about them. I won't skip entirely the part of my talk about the other folks who are coming into your city and certainly poised to come into your city, which is an even bigger demographic, the front-end boomers, and eventually all the boomers. And what we see in the cities that have become more walkable, and I'm sure this is happening here, is that the millennials arrive first and make it safe, make it feel safe, and then their parents move in. And that's something you're going to see happen a lot more here in Austin. I'm sure it's already happening. These towers that you see coming downtown are too expensive for the millennials, so their parents move in. Or if you're lucky, they buy you a studio. So again, it's not really about attracting them. It's about giving them what they need. And what do they need? Well, soon they're not going to be able to drive anywhere near as well as they should drive, and they're going to be not so comfortable driving everywhere. And there's a larger segment now of this generation who are recognizing, my own parents did it, are recognizing they can have a richer, more fulfilling lifestyle in a walkable urban environment if those streets feel safe and comfortable for them. And when you're older, because I've seen my kids, my 3-year-old and my 5-year-old, scooting in the crosswalks with elderly people around them. They have to be comfortable in the street space, and they're very easily threatened. But if you have an accommodating street space of the kind that you don't really have yet in many of your streets, then they will have their needs met. And by the way, this is a phenomenon that's now 30 years old. In the early 80s, we started hearing from sociologists about something called a NORC. Has anyone heard of the NORC? The Naturally Occurring Retirement Community. And the very first one was the Upper East, that they identified in the papers was the Upper East Side of New York, where rich people who were old realized they could have a better quality of life, and they started buying it up. And that's what can happen here and will happen here, but we need to be more accommodating towards what their real needs are. And their needs are streets in which they can feel safe, not just walking along, but crossing and inhabiting. So, not sure if I have any more introduction, except to say, I don't want to forget, and I might forget if I don't say it now, to acknowledge some of the great things that I experienced, that I saw had changed since when I had been here 10 years ago. The Great Streets Project, 2 of which I walked down today, really the equal of a street in Europe, when you have the trees on both sides of the sidewalk and the cafe tables, and really, more sidewalk than car area. It's fantastic. The investment I'm seeing in bicycle facilities, which I think could be accelerated. The investment in transit, which we hope is accelerated. Reconnect Austin, which seems to be the most obvious next step for knitting the city back together, and really a very small investment for a very large. When you spend $600 million, a lot of money, when you spend $600 million to generate $3 billion of tax base, it's a good economic model. And it's something that we see happening globally, really. It's the success stories that we see all around the world are stories like that. So these steps you're taking are really great. I'm going to talk tomorrow. What, tomorrow? I'm going to talk tomorrow about the details of how to make your city more walkable. When I go to a place, I like to give 2 talks. And I have to apologize for the bait and switch. When I'm asked to give a lecture in a place, I speak about how that can happen. And I say, but if I'm going to come all the way out there, I want to give 2 talks. I want to give a talk to the entire community about why, and this is tonight's talk, why it's so important for Austin to be more walkable. I say that to every city, I just use Austin. And I say, I want to give a second talk to your elected officials, to your public works department, to your traffic engineers, to your key developers, to your downtown development association, to those folks about how to do it. And that's a 2-hour workshop, 200 slides. But I recently did it in another city, and we opened the doors to everyone, and it was even better, having the whole audience in there. So they don't have enough food for all of you. So you aren't allowed to eat breakfast. But it starts at 8:30 tomorrow? 8:30? Okay, but breakfast is 8 to 8:30. So don't show up till 8:30 because you don't get breakfast. But 8:30 tomorrow at the Ritz, is it called? At the Alamo Ritz. And it'll be a 2-hour workshop on how to do it. And it's essentially the stuff that's in my book, but my book has no pictures, and this is all the pictures. So I really do encourage a lot of you to come tomorrow, because tonight you're getting the why but not the how, which is a little frustrating maybe, but hopefully will motivate you. I'm going to take off my jacket. Oh, I can't. My mic is in it. Never mind. I'll just sweat. I've been sweating all day, so. So for me, this has been a journey of not invention, but learning from other people, mostly Andre Stwani and Elizabeth Plater-Zyberk, but watching what we've been doing for 20 years and what they've been doing for almost 40, and what lots of people, like Sinclair Black and others have been doing for many years, taking all of these lessons that I've learned and leaving design and going to work at the National Endowment for the Arts and with the Mayor's Institute on city design, and with dozens of mayors for 4 years. Every 2 months, somewhere in America, we would gather up 8 mayors and 8 designers who I'd get to pick, and we'd lock ourselves in a room, and each mayor would bring their toughest urban design challenge. We did 2 at UT. They host them at the wonderful architecture school at UT. Bob Patterson and Fritz Steiner and all those guys. The other Speck, Larry Speck, who I'm not related to, but I called him my cousin. And we would host these workshops. And in fact, the mayor of Austin came to one of them that I was at and brought the Miller Field example. Is that Miller Field? Is that what it's called? The Miller Airport. And when it was just an idea, and we critiqued it and hopefully made it a little bit better, and I hear it's coming along really well. But this experience of taking all this new urbanist stuff I had learned and then spending all these sessions every 2 months over 4 years with mayor after mayor after mayor, hundreds of mayors, and watching not the ideas change, but the discussion, the language change, and realize that it's that calling it new urbanism, well, first we called it neo-traditional design. That turned off, because it was about bringing back neighborhoods. That turned off the liberals. Then we called it new urbanism. That turned off the conservatives. And for a long time, we just called it good urban design. But the conversation shifted in this experience with mayors and other city leaders who reframed it, not using the word, but reframed it entirely around walkability. And they would ask the question, how can we get people to walk in the city? If I have street life in my city, I know I've got a successful city. And I know it's an indicator of success, and I know it's necessary for my city to be successful. And really my exercise with the book and in my practice for the past 5 or 6 years has been to reframe the argument in those terms, and I found that they just are much more actionable and instrumental than any way we've talked about it before. And I think that's what I want to talk to you about tonight. A lot of the stuff I'm going to say, you probably know some of it. Some of you know a lot of it. But I think I've also figured out the best way to communicate it. So even if I'm telling you something you already know, think about the way that I'm saying it, because maybe you could make these same arguments. Oh, and it is all in the book, which is for sale in the back. So, for years, we as urban designers were kind of shouting into the wilderness and watching, certainly the new urbanists have had a profound, profound impact in the way that America is being built. But I watched year after year, for many years, as we would discuss these issues, and they would kind of catch on, kind of not catch on. People had some interest, other people weren't so interested. And then I had an experience at the Sarasota Book Fair, I think it was 2000 or 2001, because Suburban Nation had just come out, and I met a guy named Robert Putnam, who's heard of Bowling Alone. So Robert Putnam was there presenting Bowling Alone. I was there presenting Suburban Nation. Bowling Alone was amazing. It said, among other things, he tried to figure out why there was this decline in civic engagement that he, as a demographer, that he had mapped very clearly across this country, a decline in civic engagement in America. And he correlated people's participation in their communities with all these different factors in their life. And he found no stronger correlation than the length of their commute. And essentially every 10 minutes you added to your commute, you were 10% less likely to chair an organization, to sign a petition, to mother a Cub Scout den, right? And I thought that was a really interesting lesson. We were both signing books after our talks. He had a line that went down around the corner and disappeared around a building. And I had 2 people in front of me. It was a mother. It was a father and a daughter. The mother was in prison, and they wanted to meet my publisher so they could sell her story. And I said, there's something about this social argument that's more interesting to people. As fun as these stories are, there's something about this social argument that's more interesting to people than the design argument. But actually, what I've witnessed over the past 10 years is the rise of 3 other arguments, not design and not social, that are much more powerful at convincing cities to be more walkable. So what I want to run through tonight are these 3 arguments, which are an economics argument, an epidemiological argument, and an environmental argument. The economists, people listen to economists. They want their cities to thrive. They want to attract people and corporations. People listen to epidemiologists because they want to live a long time. And people listen to environmentalists now all the more because of the climate change and extreme weather crisis that we face. I've been told in red states to say extreme weather and not climate change, but I'm in Austin, so I'll just say global warming, okay? The ice caps are melting. It's true. So not everyone listens to all three of these groups, but there are groups that people listen to more than they listen to even Robert Putnam, and certainly more than they listen to folks like me. So the start of Walkable City is actually these three arguments. The first chapter is the economics argument, the second chapter is the health argument, the third chapter is the environmental argument. Then the whole rest of the book is how you do it, and that's my talk tomorrow. So I'm going to skip the whole we're trying to attract millennials, blah, 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 blah discussion. You've heard it. There's a whole another discussion in that about how you all know about walk score? You know, every neighborhood in America is rated in terms of its walkability. There's now, thanks to walk score, we can now correlate the value of properties against walkability. It's very clear that people place a huge premium on more walkable cities. So if you want your city to be more, now affordability is a whole other discussion, but if you want your city to be more valuable, then certainly walkability is an important part of that. But there's a whole nother discussion, which is kind of the negative economic discussion, which is what have we done in America? You know, we've doubled the number of roads in this country since 1970. And in so doing, we've doubled the distance that the typical American drives every day, and we've doubled the amount that the typical American spends on transportation. So when I was young in the 70s, the typical American spent 1/10 of their income on transportation. You know, since then, we've been investing in roadways, and the typical American now spends 1/5 of their income on transportation. Working Americans who are described as earning between $20,000 and $50,000 now spend a little bit more on transportation even than they do on housing. And poor Americans are spending 40% of their income on transportation. We've burdened our society with this need to drive. And it's the poorest, well, particularly the working Americans, who fall into this trap that I'm sure you're quite aware of and maybe have heard of that's called drive till you qualify, where you have to go further and further and further from the city center to meet the bank's lending requirements, to find a house that's cheap enough to meet the bank's lending requirements. And then, of course, you go underwater in the mortgage. And then you're trapped because you haven't done the math. Some do, some don't, but many of them haven't done the math and realized that much of the savings that they get from the house mortgage being cheaper, they're actually doubling down in transportation costs. And these are the communities, these ex-urban communities, you're probably aware of some, that were hit the hardest, that were actually devastated and half emptied by the housing crash in 2008. Because their mortgages all went underwater, the price of gasoline went up markedly at the same time, if you remember. And all of a sudden, they couldn't afford the lifestyle that they had bought into. So a tremendous burden on our society. And if you even go back to the 70s, great writings by the multinational intellectual Ivan Illich. Have you heard of Ivan Illich? He calculated it out. And even back in the 70s, if you take all the time that the typical American spends to earn his car, and then stuck in traffic driving his car, that he drives the same speed as a person, that he moves the same speed as a person walking in a pre-industrial society. So in fact, we spend then 10%, now 20% of our wealth on moving no faster than we ever moved before. And we're doing it at the cost of all these other things that we could be spending money on. Because 84% of the money you spend on driving leaves the local economy instead of staying in the local economy. So we've really burdened our country, and when it comes to being competitive into the future as oil reaches $200 a barrel, and we begin perhaps due to weather events to have to curtail our moving around, we've burdened ourselves and put ourselves at a disadvantage to other nations in terms of the great wealth that's been invested. In fact, I like to say that thanks to the money we're spending on fuel, they're building glorious transit systems in Dubai and Abu Dhabi that our cars have essentially bought their trains. But that's the sad story, but there's a positive corollary, which is what does it mean in America, and it's been done in America, what does it mean in America if you decide to take a different path? And you may be tired of hearing about Portland, So Austin and Portland are almost always in the same sentence, wherever you go. But Portland is the best example we have in the US of a city that made a series of decisions, actually back in the 70s, decisions that most cities, most advanced cities are making now. But they made a bunch of decisions back in the 70s to become less auto-dependent. So while the typical American city then was building highways, they said we're going to stop building highways and we're going to build transit and bikeways. In fact, they rebuilt one Cloverleaf. They invested $65 million in bikeways, which sounds like a lot of money, but it was over 30 years, so about $2 million a year, and half the price of that one Cloverleaf that they rebuilt, actually for $140 million. But they invested in bikes and transit. If you've been to Portland, you know great streetcar, great light rail, and great buses, while everyone else was investing in highways. While every other American city was growing this undifferentiated spare tire of suburban sprawl, they instituted their now famous urban growth boundary, right? Series of decisions around driving less. Well, what's happened was, since making those decisions, their lifestyle has actually changed. They went from biking the same as the rest of America, really not so much different from the rest of America, only slightly more, to biking 15 times as much as the rest of America. As recently as a decade ago, only 8% of kids in Austin walked or biked to school. The numbers came in from last year, 43% of the kids in Portland, not Austin, Portland. Start over. That's probably right, though, about Austin. Let me back up. When I was a kid, half of us walked or biked to school. More recently, about 13% of Americans walk or bike to school. You're probably somewhere in there. So Portland went in a decade from 8% to 43% because of this decision. But interestingly, you know, we've hit peak VMT. We've hit, as a nation now, in almost every city and almost every region, we're starting to drive less. In many cities that hit in 2008, some places I'm working, it hit last year. And by the way, anyone telling you that you need to widen a highway or leave room around a highway to widen it later doesn't understand that we've hit peak VMT, right? In Portland, they hit peak VMT in 1996, and they started going downhill from there, so that they now drive 20% less than they did before and 20% less than the rest of the country. So what does that mean? An economist named Joe Courtwright, he did the math, and he found out that 20% less, which is 4 miles a day, or 11 miles a day, the typical commute went from 54 minutes round trip to 43 minutes round trip, that those 11 minutes and the 4 miles add up to fully 3.5% of all GDP, all income earned in the area. So what are they spending that money on? Knowing, again, that 84% of what you spend on cars leaves the local economy. Well, Portland, you probably know, is reputed to have the most coffee shops per capita, the most independent bookstores per capita. And let's hear it for your independent bookstore, which I guess is second only to Powell's in the country, is the largest. That's great. Buy a book from them tonight. What's it called?
Book People.
What?
Book People.
Book People. They are reputed to have the most roof racks per capita. They're reputed to have the most strip clubs per capita. These are all slight exaggerations of a truth, which is that they are spending more on almost every kind of recreation than the rest of America. Oregonians spend more on alcohol than most Americans, which could be a good thing or a bad thing, but it makes you glad they're driving less. And that's the kind of lifestyle changes that you can see when you make those decisions to change the way your city is growing. And there are much bolder examples in Vancouver, in Toronto, in Sydney, Melbourne, and of course in European cities, which actually never even thought about sprawling. And I'll be talking more about them as we go. So tremendous economic impacts. And then there's just the fact that, and this is very hard to maybe articulate, but very hard to prove, but this concept that just the sheer propinquity of walkable cities, the fact that being among each other and close together makes us more productive. The evidence is coming in. David Brooks reported on a study where a bunch of folks were brought together. One group, well, they did it with lots of groups, but one bunch of groups were brought together over the internet and asked to perform this very difficult cooperation challenge. And groups were also brought together face-to-face and asked to do the same test. And of course, the face-to-face groups thrived and succeeded, and the internet groups splintered and fell apart. So there's a real value to bringing things together. And then there's just the sheer efficiency. In Europe, I've done it. In Amsterdam, you can have 5 meetings in a day. In Atlanta, you can have 2 meetings in a day because they're on the opposite side of Atlanta, and you're stuck in traffic getting between them. And so that's a factor as well. But now there are these theoretical physicists, West and Betancourt, who have done the math, and they actually are proclaiming, it was in the New York Times Magazine, that these cities that have chosen to grow along the more dispersed model, like Phoenix, like Riverside, California, which has a ton of people in it, by the way. I know you haven't really heard of Riverside, but it's bigger than most cities. That these cities are actually performing, that the cities that have invested in spreading out and providing everyone the suburban lifestyle are the ones that are reporting the lowest production of patents, the lowest amount of inventiveness. And actually the EPA reported the more you drive in a given state, the worse that state performs economically. And you'd think it might be the opposite because driving is something we can do when we have money. But in fact, the more you drive in your state, the worse your state is doing economically. So there's many more arguments I could make. But the fundamental one is that you want to be investing your money locally, not in the tar sands and not in Saudi Arabia. And you also want to be even more of what you already are, which is a cool place to be. And the places where people want to be, because of this demographic perfect storm of pre-kid millennials and post-kid boomers who don't care about yards, schools, or big houses, but care about access to transit and a walkable lifestyle, that they want to be in that kind of city. So that's my economic argument, and it's the longest one. I'll be speeding up now. I like to say the best day to be a planner in America was August 9th, 2004, when a book came out. 3 doctors, actually 2 doctors, 2 epidemiologists and a planner, Frank Frumkin and Dick Jackson, who some of you may have heard speak, came out with this book called Urban Sprawl and Public Health. And while many of us have been shouting into the wilderness for many years about the waste and the anomie and the ugliness of suburban sprawl, they said it very simply, that sprawl is killing us as a nation. It's making us morbid. We spend 1 out of every $6 in this country on health care, and yet we have some of the worst health statistics in the developed world. And yes, there are ways we could spend less money on health care, but why is a nation that's so wealthy performing so badly in so many metrics? You've probably heard a lot of the statistics. 1/3 of Americans are now obese. A 2/3 of the population is overweight. Fully 1/3 of all children born after the year 2000 are expected by the CDC to become diabetic. It's kind of scary. 25% of young men right now and 40% of young women are too heavy to enlist in our own armed forces. And the story goes on and on and on. But for too long, these doctors were telling us, for too long now, it's been a story about diet. And God knows this is true. And Michael Pollan and that whole discussion about the dangerous American fructose diet is all true. But it's been the vast majority of the discussion has been about diet, and very little has been about inactivity, or actually inactivity born of the built environment. Inactivity that results from the fact that we have essentially legislated and built out of existence in so many of our communities the useful walk. And so we have no opportunities to walk. People aren't walking. One study, looked at inactivity versus diet. It was a British study called Gluttony versus Sloth, and it very carefully documented that it was inactivity and weight that were fluctuating together much more so than diet and weight. Dr. James Levine, in this case aptly named Mayo Clinic, put his patients in electronic underwear, and he held their diet steady and he held their weight steady, hundreds of patients. And then he started pumping the calories in. Some patients gained weight, some patients didn't gain weight, and looking for some metabolic or DNA factor at work, the only thing that he could find that distinguished the patients from each other was how much they were moving every day. And those who gained weight, on average, were sitting for 2 hours longer than those who didn't, which sounds like a commute in many American cities. So we have these studies that link weight more so to inactivity than to diet, but now we have these studies that link weight to actually where you live. Thanks to WalkScore, they were able to rate different neighborhoods of San Diego as more walkable and less walkable. If you lived in a more walkable neighborhood of San Diego, you were 35% likely to be overweight. If you lived in a less walkable neighborhood, you were 60% likely to be overweight. And now the doctors have a term for these places, obesogenic. These are called obesogenic neighborhoods. Study over 6 years, 100,000 people in the Boston area. You can just draw the rings around the city like a dartboard. The length of the commute and the distance from the city, and both the less opportunities for walking in the suburbs and the amount of commuting you're doing when you live in the suburbs is making you just each ring is heavier than the one outside of it. And these are academic studies that zero out for wealth and age and other things that correlate with body mass. So these are very useful studies. So that's part of it, and obviously the solution to obesity and obesity-related illnesses born of location is in the short term to move to a different location. I'm a bad poster child for this discussion because I've always been trying to gain weight in my life. I've always been too skinny, but when I lived in Miami, I gained some weight. And when I moved to Washington and switched from driving to transit, I lost the 6 pounds that is the average that Americans lose when they switch from driving to riding in transit. So the short-term solution is to move to a city. The longer-term solution, of course, is to make all of your places more walkable. Now, we also have an asthma epidemic in this country. 7% of Americans have asthma. We lose 14 people to asthma every day, which didn't seem like that many to me until I heard that it was 3 times the rate of 1990. Okay, 3 times as many asthma deaths as in 1990. And it's asthma principally from car exhaust. American pollution isn't what it used to be. It comes now from tailpipes, not from factories. And where you live in relation to large highways and other areas where people are driving a lot, and frankly in metropolitan areas where people are driving a lot, determines how likely you are to get asthma. And it's these cities, these most sprawling cities like Atlanta, that are suffering the most. And in Atlanta, it's funny, I was in Atlanta in 1996 for the Olympics, and the population of the city increased by 50% during that time of the Olympics. Yet the asthma hospitalizations dropped by 30% because Atlantans, being told that it would be impossible to drive around the center of the city, drove less, and so the air cleared up. And Atlanta's been a constant battle of people suffering, failing to meet federal clean air standards, being told they couldn't build highways anymore, people getting healthy again, so they got the right to build more highways, and people getting sick again. And Phoenix put Atlanta to shame. About 5 years ago, they had a year in which 4 full months of days, healthy people were told not to leave their houses. And if you look at WebMD's list of the 5 cities in which you're most likely to have asthma, and the list of America's most sprawling cities, they overlap. Or I should say, the statistic I have in my book is the WebMD cities in which you are most likely to have asthma, the 5 cities, people drive 27% more than the 5 cities in which you're less likely to have asthma. So that's a very clear correlation as well. And then finally, there's the car crash discussion, which we should think of as a health crisis, because it is. We're losing more young Americans to car crashes than anything else. 3.3 million since there have been cars. And we kind of take it for granted that it's just part of being alive, that actually there's a 0.5%, there's a 1 in 200 chance that you will die in a car crash. There's a 50% chance that you will be injured at some point in your life in a car crash. You say, oh, this is part of being out on the road. Well, guess what? Our car crash statistic is 14, actually more recently 12 deaths. It's been getting better, but not for pedestrians, but for drivers it's been getting better. 12 deaths per 100,000 in the US. It's not so, per year, not so bad. Well, Germany, with its no speed limit Autobahn, is 7 deaths per 100,000. England is 4 deaths per 100,000. Do you know who's got 3 deaths per 100,000? New York City. Maybe Holland too. But New York City has saved more lives in traffic since September 11th, 2001 than were lost on September 11th, 2001. If the whole nation shared New York City's traffic death rate, we'd save 24,000 lives per year. Because, yes, they drive less in New York, but also it's the kind of roads you're driving on. You know, so living in a city as opposed to the countryside or the suburb makes us safer. Well, sure, New York is 3. San Francisco is 3. Portland is 3. Tulsa is 14. Orlando is 20. So it's not whether you're in a city or not, it's in what kind of city do you live. Do you live in a city that was designed around walking and transit, or do you live in a city that was designed around cars? Because it's the cities that were designed around cars that it turns out are the most effective at smashing them into each other. And that's a really important thing to think about. You know, we moved to the suburbs because it's safer for our kids. Yet actually, they did the math, if you add up car crash deaths and crime, murder by stranger, you're safer in the grittiest inner city than you are in the country club suburbs, in almost every American metropolitan area. The 10 safest places to be in Virginia are its 8 toughest cities and the 2 counties up against Washington, D.C., if you add together car crashes and violent crime. So you get the point. In the short term, you want to live longer, be healthier, breathe easier, move to the city. In the longer term, make where you live more walkable. Then finally, the environmental argument, which is so fascinating because I'm old enough to have watched the environmentalists just kind of turn on a dime in this country and change their message. Because the environmental movement in America has traditionally been an anti-city movement. And if you've been around for a while, you know that. You know, starting with Jefferson, who said, cities are pestilential to the health, to the morals, to the liberties of man. If we continue to pile upon ourselves in cities as they do in Europe, we shall become as corrupt as they are in Europe and take to eating one another as they do there. He had a sense of humor. I don't think he meant it, really. And then, you know, this whole idea, you know, the environmental movement in America has been an Arcadian movement. It's been about moving to nature, uniting with nature, becoming one. In the history of the Sierra Club, and Thoreau, and all of that. And this message was only hammered home more strongly when we started mapping carbon. And a typical carbon mapping project, like the Vulcan project in Birmingham, where they map carbon per square foot, per square mile, actually, across the country. And you look at these carbon maps of the country, and they're like the night sky photographs of the country. You know, red hot in the cities, kind of mellow orange in the suburbs, dead black in the countryside. Because, of course, where there's more people, there's more carbon. But a few years ago, really about 8 years ago, Scott Bernstein, an economist in Chicago, said, is this really the right way to map carbon? And there are only so many of us in the country at any given time, and we can live in places, perhaps, that causes us to have a smaller or a larger carbon footprint. Let's map it per household. And when he mapped carbon per household, and he did it across hundreds of American cities, from Abilene to Yuma, when you map carbon per household, the map's entirely flipped. Black in the center cities, warm in the suburbs, and red hot in these ex-urban drive-to-you-qualify communities. And now the environmental establishment has understood this and is starting to point at what's called location efficiency. And the idea that where you live actually has the biggest impact on how you live. The EPA came out with a brochure, I guess it was around 2004, called Boiling It Down to BTUs, Location Efficiency and Building Type. And it said, where are you most likely to have the largest footprint? In a green LEED house, driving a Prius or not, living in the city, living in the country. And they found out that you could have the greenest house in the suburbs, complete with Prius, and you still have a bigger footprint than if you live in the middle of the city in the least green house. So it's great that the EPA is spreading this message on location efficiency. It'd be nice if people were listening, for example, the EPA, who 2 months after that report came out, took its 670-employee Sector 7 headquarters in Kansas City, downtown Kansas City, and moved it 20 miles out of town into Lenexa, Kansas, walk score 27, into a former Applebee's office park because it was a LEED building. And this, in a nutshell, I think epitomizes the way that we've gotten the environmental discussion wrong in this country, is that it's always been about the LEED rating. And LEED is good, but LEED is not enough. And we've focused, as we like to do in America, on the gizmos, on the stuff we can buy. And politicians and marketers have sold sustainability to us in terms of a marketing decision, a lifestyle decision. What can I buy to add to what I already have to make my footprint lighter, right? And I'm not immune to this. It's very attractive, this concept, what Steve Mouzon calls gizmo green, right? When my wife and I were building our new house in the District of Columbia on an abandoned lot in the heart of the city, and we've got the bamboo floors, we've got the dual flush toilets, we've got the solar photovoltaic system, the solar water heater, the double insulation, we've got the, energy saver bulbs, a wood log crackling in our German high-tech stove contributes less carbon to the atmosphere than were it left alone to decompose in the forest. That's what the brochure says. Yet all of these gizmos together don't contribute a fraction of what we contribute by living 3 blocks from Metro in the heart of a walkable city. And that's the message that we need to share. You can change all your light bulbs to energy savers, and you should, but you save as much energy in a year changing all your light bulbs to energy savers as you do in a week moving to a walkable neighborhood in your city. So if you care about this, or if you care about sustainability, then the answer, your choice is clear. But the problem is, barring some tragical circumstance of unprecedented horror, I think it's going to be very hard to get Americans to make different choices about any sustainability argument that's wrapped up in being good, right? Those of us who lived through the last energy crisis in the 70s knew it was about turning down the thermostats, wearing sweaters, taking short, cold showers. It was miserable. And you can't say, oh, you'll be an angel, so you should do this. That doesn't work because it's so hard to picture what could happen. So how can we have a discussion in this country around sustainability that's a positive one, that's encouraging? Well, the gold standard of quality of life surveys is called the Mercer Survey. It's published in some black box somewhere secret. It's called a quality of life survey. It rates all the global cities, all the medium-sized and larger cities, in terms of 10 criteria that they've determined add up to quality of life. Housing, access to nature, health care, schools, stable government, weather, transportation, all of these things. This survey, it's interesting. It tends to always be won by a bunch of places where they speak German. Zurich, Dusseldorf, Vienna. The top-ranking American city, most recently I think was Honolulu, ranked number 28, followed shortly thereafter by the usual suspects, Boston and San Francisco and Washington, D.C. and Portland, Seattle, the cities you're always hearing about. There was not a non-walkable, not a driving American city on the list. Okay? And then there's a bunch of cities that do really well also, like Vancouver and cities in Canada and Australia and New Zealand. Now, this is interesting. New York City, we talked about how healthy it is in terms of car crashes. People in New York City consume gasoline at a rate the rest of this country hasn't done since the 20s. They consume, a third of the electricity of Houston. New York City is our densest city. It has 480 subway stops, which is more than all the other subway stops in the country put together. But there are other cities that we know about that are less dense that actually perform better. So while New York City, while our cities burn half the fuel of our suburbs, and New York City burns half the fuel of the typical American city, Canadian cities like Montreal, Toronto, and Vancouver burn half the fuel of those cities. So do cities in Australia. European cities, like the Dusseldorfs and the Viennas, burn half again as much fuel. And then you can go to Hong Kong and burn half again as much fuel. I like to joke that if 10 Hong Kongers moved to New York wanting to keep their gasoline consumption steady, 9 of them would have to stay home all day. The point is that you can actually do much better than they do in New York. So it's interesting to look at this quality of life survey and see these German cities doing so well and Canadian cities doing better than American cities in terms of like being the kind of place where people want to live. Well, there's another quality of life survey. It's the Economist's quality of life survey. They use the Mercer data. They just have a slightly different criteria. They warp it. They're accused of being somewhat Anglophone in their tendencies, or I should say Anglophile in their tendencies. So places where they speak English does better, which isn't much of a help to the US, it turns out. But the winners tend to be Canadian or Australian. The winner last year was Vancouver. And Vancouver paints a really fascinating story because it's more Portland than Portland. Vancouver made a series of decisions starting in the 50s. First, to not let the highways land, right? No highways land and lace through Vancouver. And by the way, in the 1950s, you have to trust me on this one, I wasn't there either. In the 1950s, Vancouver looked just about like every other North American city. But then they said, we're not going to let the highways land, and then we're going to do three things. We're going to encourage developers to build high-rise housing in our downtown and make it easy for them. But if they're going to do that, we're going to take the money from that and invest it heavily in transit, and we're going to invest it heavily in the public realm. Streets, squares, parks. And now if you've been to Vancouver, you know it's a city of spiky buildings, of great transit, of great parks. This project really kicked into full speed really in the 90s, when they went from having 15% of all trips in the city being walking trips to 30% of all trips being walking trips. So it's an amazingly sustainable city in that regard. So I look at this and I look at their low consumption of gasoline and their lighter carbon footprint, and I have to ask, is Vancouver more livable? Does it have a higher quality of life because it's so sustainable? And I say no. The same thing that gives Vancouver a higher quality of life is what makes it so sustainable. And that's the fact that it's a walkable city. So, is sustainability a function of I should say, is our quality of life a function of our sustainability? I should say it's not. But if in this country we are so unsustainable because we're throwing away so much of our time and our money and our lives on the highway, then these two problems would seem to share the same solution, which is to make our cities more walkable. Doing so isn't easy, as you know, but it can be done. It has been done, as I've described, and it is being done in many American cities at this very moment, and yours as well as we speak. But I think we could do it with greater vigor, and I'm here to help you do that. Thank you for your attention. I think I talked longer than I was supposed to, but I welcome questions.
put this right here.
So it's interesting you talked about, start off with some social, and then you talked about some economic, ecological, these other variables. But I'm interested in some political issues in terms of the fragmented metropolis, about how cities, especially in this area, potentially are competing with one another for tax revenue and things like that. And in your experience working with mayors, has that issue ever come up? And what kind of solutions have you guys worked out in terms of dealing with that and implementing a walkable city?
It's really tough, and it's going to be tough for you in the context of the change that's about to happen to your government, which I've just learned about. I'm no expert on things Austin. And I'm not saying that what's happening with your structure of your city councilor system is a bad thing, but it makes you more like the other cities I've seen where you have a city council, like in Oklahoma City, where I'm working. You have a city council where the vast majority of the city councilors actually represent suburban interests. And their biggest concern day to day about the city is that they can zip in and out of it quickly, but they're not necessarily as invested in the quality of the downtown as you might have under the current scenario. This was something that surprised us when Toronto consolidated. And you know, we talk about the need, we as planners, we talk about the need for regional government because we live our lives regionally. You know, I used to wake up in Miami Beach and commute to Miami and then go to swim in Coral Gables and then go back to Miami Beach. And this is a typical American experience, is to go from municipality to municipality, but within one region. So we always said, why can't we govern regionally? Well, in Toronto, I guess in the 90s, they switched from a government more like the one you had now to, they consolidated with their suburbs. They made a bolder move. And all the planners hailed it as this great victory. Thus became Rob Ford. And actually, that's not the punchline I usually use, but what we've seen in the past 20 years is that the city interests have been continually outvoted by the suburban interests, and it's very hard to make those tough decisions that benefit the downtown. And those of us who study these things know will ultimately benefit the region much more than if the downtown is starved. So Mayor Mick Cornett in Oklahoma City, where we've done a ton of investment in walkability, and I'll be showing it tomorrow, he just says to his fellow city councilors, look, do you want to be a suburb of nothing? Right? And he makes the point that, and this is actually an Andres Dwani point, that the downtown of the city, no matter where you live in the city, the downtown of the city is the one part of the city that belongs to everybody. You've got the place where you live, but you've got the downtown too. It's really yours, and you know it's yours. Your pride in your city, how you sell your city, is based on the quality of that downtown. So that's a conversation to have as these changes are occurring. To understand, I'm not going to talk about how you can compete against the Houstons and the Dallases, and frankly, I think you're doing just fine. But looking at your region, the suburban interests have to be reminded that the ship rises and falls together. Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. My name is Eric Anderson. How does Austin deal with this challenge when we take a moment to acknowledge that our population density is 1/6 that of San Francisco, less than 1/2 of Portland, cities we apparently, or I certainly aspire that our city might become. And if you look at, that's just city limits. If you look at the region, it's probably way worse. Only Fort Worth is more sprawled than Austin. Houston, Dallas, San Antonio are all more dense than Austin. How do we deal with this in light of what you just mentioned, that we're going to a 10-1 system that many of us have great hopes for as a game changer, and yet there's this dark side?
What matters when you're talking about density, and a lot of people get this wrong, the question was essentially how can Austin, which is less dense than many other cities, after all I've said about the benefits of propinquity, how can it compete against other cities that are denser? People often make that calculation ignoring the degree to which a city has grown or annexed its suburbs. So actually there are a lot of cities The cities that we know as the most dense, the Philadelphias and the Bostons and the San Franciscos, are precisely those cities that haven't annexed their suburbs. But if you look at them regionally, they're not all that different from you. So the question shouldn't be, what's our density as a city? Because where you draw your city limits typically is the biggest thing determining that outcome. The question should be, what are our local densities? And do those local densities support walking, support neighborliness, support transit? Very interestingly, there's a famous chart that planners use that it maps density like this, and it maps fuel use like this. And as you might imagine, it's a downward angle. The denser your city is, the less gasoline it uses. But in fact, it's a super swoopy curve. It drops off precipitously as you start to get dense, and then it starts dropping off less and less and less. And actually, the savings in fuel from going from 2 units per acre to 20 units per acre is as much savings as going from 20 to 200 units per acre. Because we urbanists know, 20 units per acre is your normal kind of urban density of apartments, of row houses, of even some single-family homes. If you have a traditional neighborhood of apartments, row houses, and single-family homes, you're probably around a 10 to 20 units per acre. So it's that shift from the driving, half-acre lots and 1-acre lots and 2-acre lots to that moderate density of 10 to 20 units per acre that has the biggest impact on your fuel use, and I would say on all those other factors that correlate with density. So we want to look to bringing densities up to neighborhood scales, to focusing on those places where it was designed in a way that neighborhood activity and walking and not being dependent on the automobile is possible, and don't worry so much about the density as a region. I know that's not all the questions. They seem to be focused on this side of the room.
This isn't so much a question as more of a comment based on 2 things you mentioned. One being, you mentioned Vancouver encouraged the building of high-rises, and it seems like our city council and the way our city code is, it actually discourages high-rises, and it makes it difficult for developers to build high-rises. So how do you recommend we go about changing that opinion and making it easier? I mean, if anything, really, the way it's written is backwards from what it should be to encourage a walkable environment. Right now, downtown, we're limited on a base zoning of 8-to-1 floor-to-area ratio, and if you want to go above that, you have to provide community benefits, when really it should be the other way around. If you want to build less than that, then you need to build community benefits, because you're not maximizing the land area and making an area more walkable and more accessible to more people. Well, and that has an impact on what you mentioned earlier about having our parents buy us that studio, because by adding all these expenses to development, you're making development more expensive. Right now, it's a lot easier and cheaper to go build a 300-acre master plan community in Calabuta than it is to build a high-rise, and it's also a lot more profitable.
Yeah.
Just some things to think about.
I understand the intellectual discussion, and that you're right. By underutilizing a parcel of land, you should be forced to somehow contribute in some other way. However, practically speaking, I don't find that's a fruitful angle to take. I would say the way to sell high-rise is to truly manifest and celebrate the contributions to civic beauty and connectedness that those high-rises can contribute. So I do believe in, and I think the developers in the audience also would believe in being asked to contribute more money to transit, to street quality, to parks and open spaces in exchange for building more density. But it has to be sold to the public in a very clear and celebratory way. This is what you're getting in exchange for this tower. It's not that easy, though.
Jeff, we've already talked about the change with our electoral system, and I think you mentioned Urban Rail and Project Reconnect. Another major thing that's happening in the background is we are rewriting our land development code. I'm not sure how many people in here have heard about Code Next. but it's one of the most important things about shaping our city. So if we were going to make one change with regard to code next to make Austin more walkable, I know you don't know our land development code, but if we were a typical American city, what would be the one major change that you would suggest if we were a typical American city rewriting its land development code?
And I want to acknowledge that you've got a really great new comprehensive plan. Is that what it's called? The comprehensive? Imagine Austin. That one, and I've been on the jury. I know it may not mean anything to you, but the APA gave it their best comp plan award this year, which is a huge honor. And then you have, as someone who used to do this for a living, I can say, you can take it from me when I say the team that's rewriting your code is the best, or I'd say one of the very, very best firms in the nation that do this sort of work. So you're in very good hands there. And if you're not aware, what they're doing is essentially turning your statistical and legalese-based code into what's called a form-based code that deals much more directly with how buildings shape the public realm. Because at a certain point, the planners figured out that the FAR can be irrelevant, and so many other things which our zoning codes control can be irrelevant if the building doesn't just step up to the sidewalk, hug the street, put the parking in the back, and do all those other things that make for convivial public spaces. So I would suspect that this code is going to do this anyway. But I asked as we walked up, is it called Lamar? Yeah, so I saw the good, the bad, and the ugly today. The ugly was Lamar, although there's some really neat buildings landing on it that are doing the right thing. And I asked, these new buildings that are landing on Lamar, are they required by the code to hide the parking in the back? And actually, the answer I got was uncertain, but I suspect very strongly the new code will put the parking in the back. But the biggest challenge, that's the easy answer. But the biggest question, which is harder to answer, is what every city now is fighting with that's a walkable city is parking minimums versus maximums. And you can't make a city get rid of parking if the alternatives aren't good. So it has to be a two-part deal. And you've got to enhance your transit, enhance your key bus, BRT corridors. I mean, you're doing it. You need to do more of it. You need to create a circumstance where the choice to not have a car is a good choice. Then, as you do that, you need to eliminate parking minimums and potentially introduce parking maximums, which is something that other American cities are doing and have done. But it's really got to be a two-part deal. And I should say, don't in any neighborhood even start to talk about this without first getting all the neighbors together and saying, we're going to make a parking preservation plan for you. You who currently live in this neighborhood and who park on this street, you will not lose this spot on this street, because we're going to institute a parking permit system that's available only to prior residents, and there's a dozen different ways to do it, and they work. We're doing it in Washington, D.C. Our on-street parking, we have a car now, and our on-street parking is preserved as thousands of units land around us because of this resident-only, prior resident-only, what do you call it? A PROPP, prior resident-only parking permit. But I've got one other interesting point to make on this topic, if I may, which is that in walkable cities, in cities with good transit, and they don't have to be super dense, in Somerville, Massachusetts, actually Somerville is super dense, but it's 3 stories tall. In Somerville, Massachusetts, outside of Boston, which has great transit, the city chief planner was telling me the story he'd seen, and I've subsequently heard the same story in Washington, D.C. 2 developers came, built 2 different buildings. One developer said, no, my tenants, I like to provide parking for my tenants, my bank requires it, whatever, and he put in 1 parking space per unit. Another developer came and said, I don't think I need it, and put in no parking spaces per unit. Of course, the neighbors were so upset about the no parking spaces per unit. Oh, these folks are going to be parking on our street. Well, guess what happened? Everyone who moved into the building with the parking spaces were people who owned cars. They brought their cars, and then they parked them on the street. Everyone who moved into the building with no parking spaces were the people who self-selected to live in those buildings, didn't own cars, weren't going to own cars, don't contribute to parking on the street or traffic in the street. because they arrive without cars. So as sectors of your city, and some of them are there now, not the whole cities for sure, but as sectors of your city become more walkable, you need to understand that actually the parking requirement can make it harder for current residents to maintain the status quo on their streets.
My name is Wendy. This is my question, and that is, would you talk a little bit to your feelings about preservation of older, I'll call them urban, suburban neighborhoods, you know, neighborhoods like Hyde Park, Clarksville, you know, there's a number of different neighborhoods all over town, and if there's any influence on trying to preserve those and walkability of different areas.
You know, I don't talk much about preservation because I kind of feel like most people get it. Like, most people understand the value of that, yet every day we're seeing wonderful houses and other buildings torn down. So it's not an expertise of mine, but I will share with you the best thing I ever heard, which is the economist Donovan Ripkema. Has he ever spoken here? Don Ripkema. And he's an economist. He happens to focus on preservation, but he's an economist first. And what he says is that in competitive economies, it's the differentiated product that commands a price premium. Right? In competitive economies, it's the differentiated product that commands a price premium. Well, think about America and what we've... Can you hear me? Yeah. Think about America... I'll trade with you. Think about America and what we've built for the past 60 years. Every part of America looks exactly like every other part of America. There's almost no reason to travel anymore. You know, certainly one suburban ring around one city is exactly the same as the next. But what makes the cities different, frankly, is this pre-war, really pre-1950s, I would say mostly, with some exceptions that are later, pre-1950s stock of buildings and houses. And so what sells you as a city to people who are into tourism or people who just want to live in a cool place are those older buildings that make you different. So every old building you tear down is eliminating some of your economic advantage over other places. And that was the most convincing argument that I've heard from an economist about that. One more? One more. Yes, over here. You just shout.
Well, I grew up in Toronto, so I totally get what you're talking about with that. And I was living in Melbourne before I came to Austin. And people ask me, you know, regarding this issue, you know, what's my experience with it? And being in the States, what I experience is this classism around walking, and that, you know, the poor people walk. And we're too good for walking, so we have cars. And even here, friends of mine will insist on picking me up because they don't want me to walk. Like, heaven forbid if I have to walk. And so how do we resolve that? Is that just a question of time and the more examples we see, the more normal it becomes? Or is there actually something that we can do to sort of push that along, you know?
Well, thank you for giving me a last question, which is an easy question, because I think you kind of answered it, but I think most people in the room would say that that is a way of thinking that is becoming less common. And particularly as the millennials become dominant, a lot of us are fearing that. But as the millennials become dominant in our society, and polls clearly show that, you know, the iPhone is the new car, and that driving and frankly even homeownership is not viewed at all in the same positive way it was by prior generations. And that these folks really want to take transit, and they want the freedom that comes with not being stuck in traffic. That's changing on its own, so I think you just got to keep a stiff upper lip until that happens. So thank you all for your attention. I'm gonna sprint to the book table where I will be signing books.
Which is right over here.